Hey, Patreon people. Love that there's some new people out there. Even if you are watching this, well, actually, you can't watch this for free. This is only for paid members. But if you are hearing this for free anywhere else, please, patreon.com/music is not a genre. Join for free for a week. Try it out. If you like it, join for $1 a month. If you really like it, go to $5 or $10 a month. But either way, this is the kind of stuff you get. This is the bonus MxTRA for Season 8, Episode 25, which was on Producers of the 2010s. And as promised, the topic is the death of genre bias. I talk about this all the time. The name of the podcast, Music is Not a Genre, kind of gives it away, right? Came up with that name 10 years ago, 2016, shortly as I was promoting the Sunshine Seminar, which I talked about in the main episode here. That was the featured song, was from that album. And realized that that's how I produced that album, and that's how I wanted to approach music. And it was something that was becoming a big thing in the 2010s, partly from streaming and partly from artists finally saying enough pigeonholing. Not that they didn't say that before, but the kind of convergence of being able to say that at a time when the culture was embracing that, huge. And that's what this is about. That to understand why and how genre bias died, and especially why this is so important, we need to do a brief history of genre bias. I have done episodes on the history of genres in general, and I've done episodes on the bias. So consider some of this a recap. 1930s and 40s, genre was used as segregation, as so much of the culture was. Modern genre bias arguably begins with the music industry's attempts to categorize audiences even more than music, although they went hand in hand. Record labels, radio stations, and retailers divided music into categories such as race records, which would become R&B and things like that, jump blues, hillbilly music, which would become country or country and western, as well as popular standards, jazz, and classical. The industry was growing, and they needed to find a way to categorize so that they could market properly. And while that is understandable, and I've always said that genres are a good shorthand, I have mentioned this in other histories I've done, that the music industry's insistence on doing this to such a detrimental degree and to play into the segregated society that we had far more then than we do now, was really what subsequently damaged our impressions of what music should and could be. These categories were often rooted as much in race, class, and geography as in musical characteristics. Listeners generally consume music within the cultural communities they belong to. There was no other way for them to hear the music they wanted to if they weren't traveling or didn't know somebody from a different culture. So they would just listen to what they were given. Genre wasn't just a musical distinction, it was often a social one. And that distinction was both created and encouraged by the music industry and the powers that were in those decades. 1950s, rock and roll challenges boundaries. Rock and roll emerged from the blending of rhythm and blues, country, gospel, and pop traditions, and other things. Artists like Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard drew from multiple traditions. Bias was cut more along generational lines than in previous eras due to the teen culture booming and the industry understanding that teen culture was a commodity. While rock initially crossed boundaries and melded styles, it soon became a genre identity of its own and got kind of quantified in a way that would then create different kinds of genre bias within rock itself in the next decade. The first great genre fusion quickly became another genre tribe. Children of immigrants, take note. Do you notice how, starting right from the beginning of the industry in this genre distinctions, this is so tied to culture and so tied to ethnicity and class and race and all of that stuff. And that's not by accident. And then when things like this happen, where new music comes to the fore that had been around a while but didn't have a name and didn't really become a thing until the 50s, and I'm talking about rock and roll, that all of a sudden the powers that be and other people who were too rigid would say things like, well, rock and roll is only this and not this. And when new rock would come along, it would be denigrated because it was not like the old rock. Just the way if we are children of immigrants, or recent immigrants ourselves, many of us very quickly denigrate newer immigrants to distance ourselves, which disgusts me. 1960s, youth culture creates musical identities. So the youth culture that had started in the 50s created tons of identities in the 60s. You have rock, soul, folk, country, jazz, and pop. They all were kind of mixed together in the 50s and before then, and certainly would and continue to be mixed together in different ways. But as far as how they were perceived, they became increasingly distinct, and the audiences became increasingly distinct. This, to me, is really the decade when the idea of what we think of as genre bias took form in the way that we have known it since then. Music preferences became tied to cultural values, tied to lifestyles, again tied to race, tied to politics, even tied to your different beliefs, tied to even maybe whether or not you were religious. It was, again, cultural values. So if you liked a certain type of music or artist that didn't fit into the culture you grew up in, you might have been ashamed even to say that you did, or afraid to, and had to find your people, quote unquote, if it was even possible. Fans began defining themselves by the music they listened to. And even though the 60s were far before, I came of age, that's the world I inherited. And we'll get there. Now, back then, it was folk versus pop folk in particular. Oh, no, that's not real folk. Rock versus, stuff that didn't rock as hard, that was a little more easy listening. Or rock versus non-rock. Jazz traditionalists versus rock audiences. I talked about this, I think, in the Northern Soul and in a couple of other episodes, where especially in Britain, but even here, there were people, there was like trad jazz people, and then the mods who were more into modern stuff. And that's kind of this distinction. And boy, talk about people, coming to blows. Music became a statement about who you were. Huge and widespread genre bias that was reinforced everywhere you turned. And again, this is where the next several decades, ideas of musical tribalism were almost entirely codified. 1970s, genre tribalism intensifies. Thought it was bad in the 60s. They became more specialized and self-contained in the 70s. And at the same time, there was crossover happening in the 70s that would expand music in a way that would affect all subsequent music. The things that I've talked about when I talked about producers of the 70s, albums of the 70s, the music from the 80s, 90s, and beyond couldn't have happened without those types of amalgamations. So the musicians themselves, many of them, didn't care about the genre distinctions and would cross boundaries. Sly Stone deliberately wanted a band with black people, white people, men, women, to prove that point, and others did the same thing. But radio stations and industry would segment audiences into distinct formats. The formatting became really stringent in the 70s and not nearly as stringent as it would become. Record stores would physically separate genres into different sections, not for the first time, but certainly more so than ever before. When I think of a record store, I think of what I inherited from this decade, which is you go into an old Sam Goody or whatever. If you wanted pop, don't go to the rock section, don't go to the jazz section. Everything was very, very distinct. Now, again, that could be helpful. Genres are a shorthand, but that mindset of don't pollute the waters is hurtful. Notable rivalries, of course, in the 70s, rock versus disco, which became very mean and based in race and gender and sexuality bias. Punk versus corporate rock. Punk rose because what was seen as the corporate rock, prog rock and kind of mainstream rock, was getting overblown or whatever. And jazz fusion versus traditional jazz. Kind of similar to the thing I talked about in the 60s. Fusion would allow other forms of music to infiltrate jazz, and traditionalists would be like, no, that's not jazz. Country versus mainstream pop was a huge thing. Country versus rock, even though you had people already mixing it by then. Huge bias. And forget it. You thought the bias in the 70s between country and rock and pop was bad. Let's wait till the 80s. Genre loyalty became a part of personal identity. and more than ever was making headlines. It was also a peak of the connection between genre and politics, race, gender, and sexuality, and very volatile because of that. It didn't start that way, but by the end of the 70s, you were considered a certain kind of person if you liked disco. Even if you also liked rock, if you liked disco and dance music at all, you were quote unquote a certain type of person. So really, you know, that kind of bias and discrimination was, I think, at its peak. 1980s, subcultures flourish alongside peak genre identity. MTV exposed listeners to more music than ever before, but genre tribes remained strong. Metalheads didn't necessarily mesh with punks. It certainly didn't mesh with hip-hop fans or new wave fans or dance music fans. And country fan, they occupied a completely separate world. Musical taste increasingly functioned as social signal. Questions like, what kind of music do you listen to, were kind of like somebody asking you, what kind of person are you? So those things that were kind of, again, set forth in the 60s were I think the strongest ever in the 80s as far as that. Not quite as volatile, I think, as in the 70s, but strongest more as almost like a social signal more than anything else. In that decade was often very reluctant to admit that I liked a certain band or all kinds of music in general to certain people for fear of being singled out as weird or disloyal or too soft or too hard or too masculine or too feminine or too black or too white. It was a constant stressor. We all went through it, except for those very few people who, for some reason, have always been immune to that. Yet underneath this was the first subtle signals that genre bias would eventually die out. The 80s was not the first time that this idea of genre bias was not a great thing. Every decade has some of that. The 70s was like proto that, with the musicians kind of leading the way. The 80s, the music industry itself saw these amalgamations, rock mixing with hip hop, etc., that would lead the way towards genre bias very, very slowly dying. That was me taking a sip of water. 1990s, genre bias was rampant but not taken as seriously. People were starting to cross lines and seek out other music. The 1990s may have represented the height of genre tribalism to some people, but when you revisit it, you realize, especially if you lived through it, that it was not as volatile or and not as discriminatory as it was in the 80s, for sure. It was just not taken as seriously, as I mentioned. Yes, if you liked grunge and alt-rock, you probably didn't like hair metal or something, but secretly you did, and eventually you'd tell people you did anyway and all of this stuff, and it wasn't as big a deal as it used to be. Hip-hop, more people were crossing into hip-hop from the rock world. Country was a huge thing. Electronic music was coming to the fore. Metal and pop, they all developed passionate, highly distinct fan communities and the festivals that went along with them. But there was enough crossover within the fans especially that, again, you might have defined yourself in opposition to one. Like, that was the last decade to me when you were like, is it Tupac? Is it Biggie? Is it Pearl Jam? Is it Nirvana? You know, like those kinds of things. That was really the last decade when that was rampant. But again, it was more of a, I like red, you like blue, as opposed to you come from a different world and I hate you, you know, or whatever the previous decades had shown. But there were still a lot of rock fans dismissing pop in the 90s. Rockism continued to this day, but really 90s and 2000s, I think, kind of when it peaked. Hip-hop fans would dismiss rock, although, again, not the artists. Metal fans would dismiss everybody else because nothing was hard enough. And a friend of mine, again, said that he thinks that the 90s was when metal got the hardest it would ever really become, and even though things have come along that are different, nothing has been able to get harder than what the 90s achieved. Alternative fans would reject mainstream music altogether. I knew so many people who were elitists, who continue to be elitists, who only listen to obscure music, alt music, whatever you want to say, and then others who can only listen to the most well-trodden pop music and mainstream artists. And I am not a fan of either of those kinds of thinking. Genre preferences became cultural boundaries that were increasingly enticing to cross, both for fans and musicians. That's why, regardless of what you might read online, the 90s were not the peak of genre bias. Absolutely not. The 2000s, the cracks begin to show on the surface. Cracks had been there, and they were showing in the 90s, but on the surface, 2000s. The internet made musical exploration easier than ever. MP3s, file sharing, blogs, online radio, and early streaming reduced barriers between genres. Artists increasingly collaborated across genre lines. You think of Danger Mouse and people like that. Younger listeners began building libraries that mixed hip-hop, indie rock, electronic music, pop, country, and older catalog music. This was really the beginning of the end, the 2000s, when genre bias got sick, let's say, and didn't quite realize yet that it was terminal. Examples, Kanye sampling rock and electronic influences, Outkast blending funk, rock, pop, and rap, Gorillaz treating genre as irrelevant, basically. Genre bias was strong, and I know people who were huge fans of 2000s music who have it, but I will contend that those fans of 2000s music do not have nearly the strength of genre bias that people in the people who stopped developing in the 90s or especially 80s or 70s have. It first time, genre bias faced meaningful technological and cultural pressure in the 2000s. The walls were still standing, and that's including in the industry, but they were beginning to crack because the 90s impulse of wanting to explore outside of your boundaries was accelerated by the internet's equalizing anything that could be downloaded, legally or not. So the setup for the 2010s, finally get, to the meat of this. By the end of the 2000s, music was becoming increasingly accessible. Fans' interests were becoming more eclectic. Artists were becoming more adventurous. Technology was making genre boundaries harder to enforce. No, the 2010s did not invent genre fluidity. They just further accelerated the process that had been unfolding for decades, and especially in the previous decade. The difference was that for the first time, the industry, the artists, and the audience all began moving in the same direction at once, away from genre as identity and toward genre as possibility, as a set of tools. Which brings us to the actual death of genre bias. So what if the most important musical trend of the 2010s was not any of the music itself, EDM, trap, wasn't streaming, wasn't hip-hop? It was the death of genre bias. I think that's true. Because I remember talking about this with a friend of mine as early as the early 2010s, certainly by the mid-2010s, how eclectic everybody's tastes were becoming and how easy it was to have a mix of things. Every playlist I have ever made, prior even to this, go back as far as the 80s, but certainly after, and you can find them streaming, ask me and I'll send you links, and I have shared those links before, does not stay in one lane. And that was true for a lot of people, especially starting in the 2010s. Musicians didn't stay in their lane. The definition of genre bias as laid out by its history was musicians staying their lane, fans identifying themselves primarily by a single genre or a couple genres in opposition to others, industry gatekeepers categorizing artists and fans rigidly, and the idea that liking one genre somehow excluded liking another and excluded you from a certain group. Some of what I'm going to talk about here, which is the death of genre bias, will be an encapsulation of what I just said, and then I'll go on to explain what happened in the 2010s that really killed the genre. Yes, as we know, genre tribalism used to be real. Much of modern music history, genre was identity. Rock versus disco, metal versus pop, country versus everybody, punk versus prog, hip-hop versus rock, whatever. People didn't just listen to genres, they belonged to them. You might even mention, or you might even remember that record stores were physical manifestations of genre boundaries with their classifications. Music lived in separate bins. But technology broke the walls, starting with free downloads and paid downloads. Any genre could be accessed which reduced friction because it wasn't a radio program or a record store saying you can't put those two things together. It encouraged exploration. Algorithms, in general, don't care about loyalty. They really do. They care about genre to a certain extent because they're going to pigeonhole you if you let them run you. But if you listen to everything to confuse the fucking algorithm, then the algorithm will learn from that and be like, okay, you like everything, we're going to throw everything at you, you know? You can listen to Kendrick, Fleetwood Mac, Bad Bunny, Billie Eilish all together, and the algorithm will say, all right, if you like those, then you like, pick your thing. Artists stopped asking permission. That was one of the biggest shifts in the 2010s. They ignored genre expectations. There have been artists throughout history who have done that, but have been either shunned because of it or pigeonholed in a way of not being mainstream enough or accessible enough or viable enough economically, that they weren't promoted, or the label would drop them and force them into do the next album like you used to or whatever. But by the 2010s, none of that mattered. You had, again, people like Post Malone, Lil Nas X, The Weeknd, Beyonce, just exploring genre left and right. The question became, instead of what genre are you, to what sounds do I want to use? Sometimes now the artist would then be like, this album is going to be my EDM album or whatever, and that's fine. I like that. That can be fun. I've done it before. But I often and most usually prefer artists who say, no, this album will have a little bit of me, of everything that's in me. I just love that. It's I think the biggest artistic statement you can make. Also, fans changed too. This is the biggest story. A teenager, in previous decades might have been a rap fan, a country fan, a punk fan. But by the time the end of the 2010s came along, teenagers themselves didn't care to be pigeonholed into one or a set of genres. And more importantly, I think, or equally as important, they didn't care about themselves being pigeonholed, but they also didn't care about what others liked or didn't like and didn't judge them for that. They might agree or disagree, but they wouldn't say, oh, wait, you're a country fan, but I'm a hip hop fan. I can't be your friend. Nope. Not in the 2010s. And when kids can do that, you know that a bias is dying. People would listen more, and especially teenagers, according to the mood they were in or an activity they were doing or situation, as opposed to a genre. Now, did genre itself die? No. Genre is still a nice shorthand. It helps us communicate. It gives us a little indicator. Oh, it's going to be kind of like this. It helps stores and streaming services organize music, helps us find music. It helps create communities even. And we still talk about genre all the time. It's not genre that's dying. It's the genre prejudice, the genre bias, and prejudice in general. By the way, genre general. Despite what's being shouted by the smallest factions of vocal idiots in this world, prejudice is dying. It has been for decades and will continue to die. Genre loyalty is identity dying. Identity in general becoming more fluid. The 2010s, no, didn't kill genre. Nothing will kill genre. Again, useful tools. They're still meaningful. They're still part of how we understand music. They're a valuable shortcut. But what the 2010s may have killed is the idea that your genre is your musical, cultural, or personal identity. For the first time in popular music history, you could ask somebody, what kind of music do you like? And it didn't matter how they answered. Only this and this, this and this and this. Okay. And you're not going to be judged or challenged, unlike in other eras, for sure. So here we are in the 2020s, continuing the 2010s trend of not staying in genre bubbles, which means everything's great, right? Including the world. No. Just like the world, it's still a struggle. And the biggest struggle is for that tiny block of bigots who seem far bigger than they are to realize that no matter how loudly they shout, they lost the war years ago, decades ago, the cultural war, the artistic war. They've been slowly losing, and that's probably why they're scared. And I get it. When you feel like the world you knew is dying. But if you're not open to the world that's here now, then you yourself are kind of dead. And it's not an age thing. I've encountered people from age 15 to near death who just insist on being biased. I have encountered, teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s who are like, rock is the only good music, or pop, or whatever it is. It's not an age thing. It's less frequent, but don't blame it on age. And you know why? Because I said this before. If you blame things on age, then it gives you an excuse to get lazy. It gives you an excuse, well, I'm old now, I don't need to be in shape. So you stop doing things that keep you in shape, which affects your health more than anything else and can cause multiple problems as you get older. Same thing can be said for how you think and how you consume things in the world, whether it's music or television or art of any kind. If you say to yourself, well, I'm old now, I should only really, I'm okay just liking the stuff that I grew up with, that's on you. So that's where you live then. You don't actually live in the current world. I feel passionate about this. If it's insulting, I want to hear from you because I want to know why you disagree with me, you know? Again, it's not that actual genre bias will ever die. It's that, like the rest of society's progress, it will become the shrinking exception rather than the rule. And as both a fan and a music creator, I could not be happier about that. It's made me a little more reactionary when I encounter people who need to be more rigid and puritanical. I've always kind of been that way, but more so now, because now it's so widespread that you don't need to be that way, that it just boggles the mind and rubs me the wrong way when I meet somebody who is. But either way, I think that these results and these the developments are positive and can only lead to more positive things. But what do you think? I want to know what you think about all of this, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this bonus MXtra, and I will talk to you next week.